Hello everyone, today we are going back in time, not to some idyllic Roman villa, but to a very specific and frankly terrifying moment on one of the most famous roads in history. Imagine, if you will, the gentle chirping of cicadas in the Italian summer heat, dust rising from your sandals as you trudge along an incredibly well-built cobblestone road. This is Northwest Ordinary Road, though. This is the Appian Way, a 400-mile-long road, a veritable Roman superhighway that linked the eternal city of Rome to the bustling port of Brundisium. You were one of thousands who may have traveled this road in 73 BC, perhaps on your way to visit family, take care of some business, or just to admire the engineering marvel before you. But as you turn the corner, a truly horrifying sight assaults your senses, something that will stop you in your tracks and make your stomach drop. You probably wouldn't survive if you were actually there, or at least, you'll wish you hadn't. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually like what I'm doing here. Now, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it? Post it in the comments below. Lining either side of this magnificent road, stretching for miles as far as the eye can see, are crosses. Not just a few, but some 6,000 people suspended from them. This isn't some gruesome art installation, this is a very public, very final, and utterly horrifying warning. The dead and dying are rebellious slaves from the Spartacus uprising, a name you might remember from history class as that guy who led a whole bunch of gladiators to freedom, or at least, tried to. These poor souls, viewed as traitors by the Roman state, were punished with their single harshest method of execution, crucifixion. The message, scrawled in blood and agony across the Italian landscape, was chillingly clear: this, my friend, is the fate of all who would dare to defy Roman power. It's the ultimate billboard for, don't even think about it. The low moans, the desperate cries, the guttural sounds of misery from thousands of crucified individuals would likely have been audible from miles away, carried on the breeze across the fields. And the grisly spectacle wouldn't end when they finally fell silent. Oh no. The bodies were left posted on those crosses, decaying slowly under the merciless sun, until they fully decomposed, or were entirely consumed by wildlife, a process that could take months. Imagine, 4 months afterward, one of Rome's main economic arteries, a lifeline for trade and travel, was a literal highway of death. Your commute would have been, shall we say, less than pleasant. If you were a free Roman citizen, strolling past this grim display, you might have felt a sense of grim satisfaction. You'd probably view it as a just comeuppance for these rebellious slaves who had plunged the heartland of Italy into chaos and disturbed what you, as a respectable citizen, viewed as the proper balance of society. After all, societal order was paramount, and these folks clearly didn't get the memo. However, if you were one of the perhaps 30% of inhabitants of Italy who were enslaved, you would probably shiver at this open display of brutality. The intended message would certainly not have been lost on you. Step out of line, even a tiny bit, and this is your fate. It was evidently taken to heart, because after Spartacus, there was never another slave uprising anywhere near the scale of his rebellion. It's almost as if Rome had achieved a chilling peace through superior brutality. Historians still argue whether this specific display of terror truly prevented future large-scale revolts or if other factors contributed more to the cessation of such uprisings. Now, while the Romans may have perfected crucifixion, turning it into an art form of terror, they certainly didn't invent it. This charming practice actually came to them through the Greeks. Alexander the Great, a conqueror of considerable ambition, was apparently a noted fan, employing it with regularity. But its origins seem to run even further back, all the way to the Assyrian Empire of the Bronze Age. That means the concept of the cross predated Rome itself by a good 2,000 years. Think about that for a moment. Long before Romulus and Remus were arguing about where to build a city, people were already figuring out how to nail other people to wooden beams for public display. Despite the antiquity of the practice, modern people tend to associate it with Rome more than any other state. This is largely because of how eagerly the Romans embraced the practice, plus the sheer number of individuals the Romans crucified for a wide range of offenses. They really leaned into it, like a teenager discovering a new, slightly disturbing hobby. There's a temptation among some apologists for Rome's imperial ambitions to paint crucifixion as just a bit of nastiness that accompanied Rome's generally positive project of civilization and progress. You know, like a small, unpleasant side effect, akin to forgetting your umbrella on a slightly rainy day. But this reading is pretty at odds with the historical reality. Crucifixion was not some unpleasant side effect of Rome's dominance, like a persistent cough. The terror it inspired was, in fact, the definitive representation of Roman civilization to the millions of people who lived in the shadow of the cross. It was their calling card, their, "Hello, we're in charge now, and we're not messing around." The Romans themselves were fully aware of the immense cultural power of crucifixion. They understood its psychological punch. There's a famous story about a young Julius Caesar, yes, that Julius Caesar, before he was the big cheese, who was kidnapped and ransomed by pirates. When he was finally released, he supposedly told them, with a straight face, that he would live to see them crucified. It's said the pirates laughed at the sheer audacity of this foolish, ambitious young man they'd managed to capture. "Oh, you're a funny one, little Caesar," they probably thought. But Caesar wasn't kidding. He did indeed live to see all of those pirates killed, but here's the quirky tidbit: they were not crucified. After having spent so much time among the pirates, they'd become too human in Caesar's eyes. He couldn't stomach the thought of them suspended from crosses for days on end with insects and birds picking away at their bodies. So, he opted for the relatively more humane execution by slit throat. Caesar's decision makes it crystal clear that Romans knew crucifixion really was that bad. And remember, Caesar was an experienced military man, no stranger to death and certainly not a squeamish personality. If he thought it was too much, that tells you something. Rome's true VIPs, like the orator Cicero, did their absolute best to not even think about crucifixion. Cicero, a master of words, once declared, "Let the very word cross be far removed from not only the bodies of Roman citizens, but even from their thoughts, their eyes, and their ears." His queasiness is representative of a notable pattern in Roman literature, a marked avoidance of the topic of crucifixion. It's highly likely the practice was seen as too grotesque by the standards of the educated aristocrats who composed much of the surviving Roman literature. They wrote about war, politics, philosophy, even wild parties, but crucifixion? Nah, let's just gloss over that bit. But bear in mind, even these relatively genteel Romans would have still likely attended gruesome gladiator fights and dangerously thrilling chariot races. That crucifixion was still beyond consideration for them speaks volumes about its perceived horror. It's like saying, "I love action movies, but I draw the line at documentaries about root canals." One rare exception to this pattern of silence is a brief passage from Seneca the Younger, a Stoic philosopher. He describes the physical impact of crucifixion on a condemned individual, as well as the unsettling ways that Roman soldiers would amuse themselves by crucifying victims in a range of uncomfortable positions. You can almost imagine the soldiers, after a long day of conquering, trying to outdo each other with creative, painful poses. But our best sources of information about crucifixion from this period actually come from non-Romans, like the Jewish historian Josephus and the authors of the Gospels. These conquered populations were the primary targets of crucifixion, and they certainly had a lot to say about it. They were, after all, the ones literally living under the shadow of the cross. For the condemned, crucifixion must have been an agony beyond imagining. But the practice was never just about execution. After all, there are much quicker, less theatrical ways to kill a person than nailing them to a cross and letting them slowly expire. Think about it: a quick sword stroke, a poisoned cup, even just pushing someone off a really tall building. But crucifixion was first and foremost a weapon of psychological warfare and a powerful tool of propaganda. It was a means of enforcing the domination of Rome's ruling class and their ideology. It broadcast the impunity of the Romans while constantly reminding the subjected populations of their second-class status and perpetual vulnerability. It was the ultimate mic drop, Roman style. In fact, there was a significant legal distinction that protected Roman citizens from crucifixion until the 2nd century AD. No matter how terrible their crimes might have been, a Roman citizen simply wasn't subject to this particular form of state-sponsored terror. It was a privilege of citizenship, a sort of invisible shield against the most brutal form of execution. Imagine the sigh of relief you'd breathe, knowing that even if you messed up monumentally, you wouldn't end up on a cross. This legal protection really underscores how Rome viewed crucifixion, a punishment fit only for the lowest of the low, specifically non-Romans, and especially those in subjugated territories. The practice of crucifixion was most widespread in Roman-controlled territories between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. This period, as you might know, notably includes the life of Jesus of Nazareth. During this era, you see, the Romans were in the process of progressively expanding judicial rights for their own citizens. They were becoming more civilized in their internal legal dealings, or at least, more considerate of their own people. But at the exact same time, they were massively curtailing these very same principles in occupied territories. It was a bit of a double standard, like offering a gourmet meal to your family while serving stale bread to your house guests. Crucifixion was a direct product of this division, specifically intended to pacify restive local populations through sheer terror. It was their way of saying, we're not just here to collect taxes, we're here to make sure you behave, and we're willing to go to extremes. The Roman sources themselves often refer to crucifixion as a punishment fit only for the humiliores, the lowest of the low, the poor, the enslaved, and the conquered. It was considered beneath the dignity of a Roman citizen. The Romans also embraced, like almost all ancient civilizations, the idea of collective punishment. They didn't always bother to establish the individual guilt of those who would be crucified. Indiscriminate execution of entire families, associates, innocent bystanders, and even the merely unlucky happened with disturbing regularity. It wasn't about finding the true culprit, it was about sending a message to everyone. Josephus's chronicles of the Jewish wars depict Romans crucifying anyone who happened to live in a rebellious province. This is a striking confession from a pro-Roman historian who had actually fought alongside Emperor Titus and whose account was specifically written to defend Roman conduct in Judea. Even he couldn't whitewash away the indiscriminate nature of the crucifixions. He basically says, yeah, we crucified everyone, whether they deserved it or not, because, well, we needed to make a point. Historians still argue about the exact ratio of individual guilt versus collective punishment in these widespread crucifixions, but the consensus leans towards a significant use of the latter. This widespread application of crucifixion was as central to its effectiveness as the extreme pain it induced. It wasn't just about the agony of one person, it was an instrument of terror designed to cow an entire population into submission. Because for all they knew, even if they never picked up a weapon, even if they never said a cross word about Rome, they could be the next to die in agonizing fashion if anyone else did. That's a broad overview of the social and political context of crucifixion, its purpose, and its chilling reach. But we would be remiss if we didn't describe the actual process itself. Be warned, what follows is a graphic recounting of the Roman process of crucifixion. It's not for the faint of heart, so maybe take a deep breath. Crucifixion ended on a cross, but it certainly didn't begin there. First, on the morning of the execution, the condemned individual would be stripped naked. This wasn't for modesty, it was an act of profound dehumanization, stripping away any last shred of dignity. Then came the scourging. This involved being whipped across the back and chest with a multi-ended leather whip resembling a cat o' nine tails, often with pieces of bone or metal embedded in the tips. Depending on the force used by the executioner, scourging could remove significant amounts of flesh, turning your back into a raw, bloody mess. Sometimes, the victim was so severely beaten that they died before they even made it to the cross. It was, essentially, a preamble of pain, a warm-up act before the main event. Next, if you survived the scourging, you, the condemned, were driven naked through the city. This wasn't some quiet, discreet escort, it was a public parade of humiliation. And to make matters worse, you were forced to carry the heavy transverse beam of your cross, that's the horizontal piece, to the very place of execution. All the while, you'd be continuously whipped and pelted with stones and refuse from the crowd. The entire ritual was carried out in the city proper, often in a highly visible area, to ensure that as many people as possible saw the dehumanized victim. It was designed to maximize humiliation and terror. In Rome itself, for instance, it was typically right outside the Esquiline Gate, a prominent public location where officials would also place signs denoting the individual and their specific crime. Imagine the sheer agony, the bone-deep weariness, as you stumbled through the streets, knowing exactly where you were headed and what awaited you. It really makes your morning commute feel like a spa day, doesn't it? Finally, you were attached to the cross. This was done either by nails or rope. Now, there remains scholarly debate about how often nails were truly used in crucifixion. Iron was expensive, and few extant remains of actual crucifixion nails have been unearthed by archaeologists. It's a bit of a historical puzzle, like trying to figure out if ancient Romans preferred chunky or smooth peanut butter. Most evidence, however, suggests that nails were used more often than not. Typically, it was one nail through the overlapping feet and a nail through each wrist, specifically between the bones of the forearm, the radius and ulna. Contrary to common depiction, a crucified person would not have typically had nails through the palms of the hands. The tissue and bones of the hands are simply too weak to support the entire weight of an adult body and would have torn through, like a wet paper bag trying to hold a bowling ball. It is possible, however, that nails through the palm could have been combined with rope around the wrist, and some evidence supports the idea that this practice was sometimes used. None of this, of course, could have been accomplished easily or quickly. Driving a nail through flesh and bone would have taken repeated, deliberate swings of a hammer. The process would have been slow, clumsy, and intimately agonizing. The relative absence of nails in the archaeological record has led scholars to believe that they were reused time and again. Imagine the sheer economic efficiency, even in the midst of such horror. However, some nails may have disappeared from the archaeological record for another, rather quirky reason. Romans viewed crucifixion nails as powerful healing charms. Legionaries would sometimes keep nails for themselves or sell them to merchants so they could be ground into powder for use in ceremonies. So, while you're agonizing on the cross, someone might be eyeing your nails for their next headache remedy. The eager consumption of these relics of death by Rome's civilian population really drives home just how generally accepted the practice was, even if it was considered unsuitable dinner conversation. With the victim affixed to the cross, crucifixion entered its final, prolonged stage. The condemned would be left to die slowly over a period of several days. The physical pain during this process would have been utterly intense. The entire weight of your exhausted body pulled relentlessly on the nails or ropes that bound you to the cross, causing excruciating pain in your arms, legs, and torso. You weren't just suspended, you were being pulled apart, inch by agonizing inch. Not only were you subjected to the elements, the blistering sun, the chilling rain, the biting wind, but each individual breath became an exercise in agony. To allow a full inhalation, victims had to raise themselves up against the beam of the cross, increasing the unbearable pressure against their ropes or nails, and scraping the bare, flayed flesh of their back against the coarse wood of the cross. By the time thirst and hunger set in, the victim had doubtlessly long been wishing for death, begging for it. But that could still be days away. The process pushed the human body to its absolute brink, meaning that the causes of death among crucifixion victims could vary widely. Blood loss from the initial scourging was a common killer and may, in fact, have been the ultimate cause of Jesus' death, as he died after only several hours on the cross. Some died by asphyxiation due to the sheer difficulty of inhaling while suspended, your diaphragm struggling against the unnatural angle. Others perished due to the buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood from an inability to properly exhale, slowly poisoning themselves. The unimaginable stress that this process placed on the body was such that it could, and at least once did, prove fatal even to a person who'd been taken down from the cross alive. The Jewish historian Josephus writes that he was once able to convince the Emperor Titus to free 3 men who had been crucified. But, tragically, 2 of them eventually died from their wounds despite being cared for by the best doctors available. Josephus recounts, "And when I was sent by Titus Caesar with Syrian and 1,000 horsemen to a certain village called Thecoa in order to know whether it were a place fit for camp, as I came back, I saw many captives crucified, and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind, and went with tears in my eyes to Titus, and told him of them, so he immediately commanded them to be taken down, and to have the greatest care taken of them in order to their recovery, yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered." It's a stark reminder that even a rescue from the cross didn't guarantee survival. Crucifixion was designed to last for as long as possible, prolonging the suffering. But if the Romans wanted to grant a degree of mercy, or maybe they just had to leave the area for some reason, they would perform a practice called crucifixio. This involved breaking the legs of the crucified person, making it impossible for them to push up and allow for proper inhalation. This would result in a much faster death, typically by asphyxiation. It was when the soldiers came to break Jesus' legs that they saw he was already dead, and thus, didn't need this gruesome final act of mercy. It's a testament to the sheer public nature of the process that the Romans were well aware of the horrifying reality of crucifixion, even if they preferred not to dwell on it. But despite the disdain of aristocrats like Cicero, there was never a widespread social movement to abolish the practice within Rome. For a Roman, pragmatism and morality were not separate concepts that weighed against each other, they were often viewed as the same thing. Romans felt that crucifixion was indispensable because of its chilling effectiveness as a tool for social control that served the interests of the ruling class. It was a means to an end, and if it worked, then it was, by their definition, moral. In fact, when the provision preventing Roman citizens from facing crucifixion was eventually repealed in the 2nd century AD, the law was specifically amended to only allow the crucifixion of poor Romans. The Roman legal code of the era famously separated everyone into 2 broad social orders, the honestiores and the humiliores. The honestiores included the economic and political elite, who, no matter how heinous their crime, could be executed only by a mercifully quick decapitation. The humiliores, which basically meant everyone else, were now liable to crucifixion. So, while the scope of who could be crucified expanded, it still maintained that class distinction, ensuring the elite were spared the most brutal end. But even as the number of people eligible for crucifixion increased, absolute numbers of crucifixions began to decline around this time. This is because the Romans had come to prefer sending all but the very worst criminals to the arena for execution by gladiators or wild beasts. Crucifixion was certainly a horrific way to go, but its entertainment value was, to put it mildly, low. Romans of this era demanded ever-increasing spectacle to accompany capital punishment. They wanted a show, and a slowly dying person on a cross, while terrifying, wasn't exactly primetime entertainment. Crucifixion would ultimately be stamped out entirely by the first Christian emperor, Constantine, who banned the practice throughout the empire in the early 4th century AD, replacing it with hanging by the neck. It's no surprise that the first Christian emperor would be the one to end the practice of crucifixion, as it had long been condemned by the burgeoning church. In the end, the memory of one victim of crucifixion, a man named Jesus of Nazareth, changed the moral arc of an entire empire. The moon is probably high in the sky now, casting long, peaceful shadows. The sounds of the ancient world have faded, leaving only the quiet hum of your room. The echoes of whips and hammers, the cries of the condemned, have retreated into the quiet corners of history, where they belong. The weight of those stories can feel heavy, but remember, the passage of time also brings change, and even the most brutal practices can eventually yield to new understanding. It's a reminder of how far we've come, and how much we still have to learn from the past. Just let your thoughts drift now, like clouds across a starlit sky. The history we explored tonight is a powerful one, but it's safely in the past, a story told in the gentle quiet of your room. Feel the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blanket. Let your breathing deepen, slow and steady. There's nothing left to do but sink into the quiet stillness of the night.